We all know what it feels like getting into the car on a hot day before the AC has a chance to kick in. Even on cooler days, the inside of a vehicle can reach sweltering temperatures when sitting in the sun. The feeling is absolutely miserable, which makes the fact that nearly 40 children die this way each year even more disturbing. The 2014 hot car death of baby Cooper Harris captured Georgia and national media attention after Cooper's father, Justin Ross Harris, apparently forgot to drop him off at daycare. It initially appeared to be a horrific accident, and most people felt sympathy for the Harris family at first. However, as more details came out about Justin, who goes by Ross, seemingly living a double life, that sympathy quickly turned to disgust, with many believing he left Cooper in the car to die on purpose. While many of us kept up with the story as it was unfolding, you may not have heard the recent updates that have completely changed the outcome for everyone involved. The question still remains: was the death of baby Cooper intentional, or was it all a tragic case of fatal distraction? To answer that, we need to go behind the headlines. The morning of June 18, 2014 started out as a typical Wednesday for the Harris family. Leanna Harris woke up, got ready, and gave her husband Ross and son Cooper a kiss before leaving for work. While it was an established routine, it's not one that Leanna took for granted. Even though she and Ross had been married for over 8 years, it had taken them longer than expected to get pregnant and grow their family. The two unknowingly grew up just a mile away from each other in Demopolis, Alabama, a city near Tuscaloosa. When Leanna was 20 and Ross was 23, they were set up by friends and quickly hit it off. Leanna was always said to be somewhat shy and reserved, whereas Ross was the complete opposite, outgoing and free-spirited. They complemented each other in the best ways and were married a year and a half after Ross proposed at a University of Alabama bowl game on New Year's Eve. Leanna had grown up being raised by her single mother and always hoped that when she had a baby, it would be in the confines of a loving marriage. However, getting pregnant proved easier said than done for Leanna and Ross, and with several years of no success, they each had more time to focus on their respective careers. In 2012, Ross got a job to work as a web developer for Home Depot. He needed to relocate to Atlanta, and Leanna ended up getting a job in the city as a dietitian. While their professional lives were taking off, they still longed to grow their family. With countless months of negative pregnancy tests, Ross and Leanna were both ecstatic when they finally conceived in late 2011. Their son, Cooper Mills Harris, was born on August 2nd, 2012, and everything seemed perfect for their little family. Leanna has said that Ross stepped up as a father in ways that she never could have expected. Oftentimes, especially when a baby is extremely young, a lot of the responsibility will fall on the shoulders of the mother. With Ross, it wasn't that way at all. And even though they were both exhausted from those newborn sleepless nights, he never complained. After the initial newborn baby bliss, Leanna has gone on to say that she and Ross began struggling to physically reconnect. They actually went 9 months after Cooper was born before being intimate again, which proved to be much harder on Ross than it was on Leanna. During this dry spell, Ross turned to things like pornography, which actually ended up spiraling into a full-blown porn addiction. He ultimately came to Leanna himself with the issue, and they decided together to get him help. One of Ross's close friends was actually a psychologist who offered to be his accountability buddy, or basically like an AA sponsor for porn addiction. He helped Ross download a software called Covenant Eyes. The Covenant Eyes website says that the software tracks activity on users' devices and uses AI and filters to help keep porn at bay. It also delivers a feed of the user's activity to their accountability buddy's phone, so you can have honest and healing conversations that help you quit porn for good. With the help of his friend, Ross was able to get his addiction under control, but it kind of seems that since he no longer had free reign to watch videos like this, he needed to fuel his sexual desires in other ways. Ross ended up making multiple profiles across social media, including on the dating page called Scout. He also began using an app called Whisper, which allows people to make posts anonymously, and started chatting with people he met there using Kik, a messaging service similar to WhatsApp. His conversations on these apps would often turn sexual, and Leanna actually ended up finding a conversation with Ross asking a woman to send photos of her breasts. From there, Leanna and Ross began attending counseling at their church and seeing a sex therapist in hopes to save their marriage. Ultimately, through counseling, Leanna felt like she could trust Ross again, and things started to smooth out at home, or so it seemed. In reality, Ross just got better at hiding his conversations with other women, and his behavior was actually escalating to more than just phone conversations. Regardless, his love and attentiveness towards Cooper didn't seem to change, even though his heart might not have necessarily been in his marriage anymore. One of the perks of Ross's job at the Home Depot offices was that they had an in-house daycare for employees' children called the Little Apron Academy. The daycare was located in the main headquarters off Paces Ferry Road in Atlanta, while Justin actually worked in another facility called the Treehouse about 3 miles away on Cumberland Parkway Southeast. Since it was so close, Justin was typically the one to drop Cooper off at daycare in the mornings, with either him or Leanna picking him up depending on who got off work first. On June 18th, after Leanna left for work, Ross got up and immediately began texting women from his various secret apps. When Cooper got up, he sat and played with his toys and watched cartoons while Ross got them ready to go before leaving the house at around 8:30. Typically, Cooper would eat breakfast at daycare, but the children needed to arrive before 8:45. And this morning, Ross and Cooper were running a little late. Since he wouldn't be able to eat at the center, Ross decided to take Cooper to Chick-fil-A to eat, which is something he did a couple times a month anyway for a little father-son breakfast time. They arrived at Chick-fil-A at around 8:59, went inside and ate breakfast for around 20 minutes before heading back to the car. Ross carried a wide-awake Cooper and strapped him into his car seat and gave him a kiss before leaving the parking lot. In order to get to Little Apron, Ross needed to turn right out of Chick-fil-A onto a side road, turn right onto Cumberland Parkway, immediately move across 2 lanes into the left turn lane, make a U-turn, and then immediately move into the left lane to turn left onto Paces Ferry Road. However, for some reason, instead of getting into the left lane to turn on Paces Ferry, Ross headed straight and drove directly to work. Ross arrived at the Treehouse office parking lot at around 9:24. He backed into a relatively shady parking space before getting out of his car, a silver Hyundai Tucson. He walked into the building holding his Chick-fil-A cup and proceeded to his office as usual. While at work, Ross had conversations with a travel agent about a family cruise and researched prices of children's passports. He also spoke with a few women on Whisper and texted Leanna that he had made it to work like they did every morning. Most days, Ross would go to lunch with a few friends who worked in another nearby office. At 11:05, one of the guys texted and asked if he wanted to go to lunch, but Ross was hesitant because he was behind on an important project at work and needed to meet a deadline. However, Ross had also recently joined in on a new side business with these friends doing web developing, and they said that at lunch they could discuss his work project and some things for their company. Ross agreed to go if they came to pick him up, so the group headed to have lunch in the cafe of nearby Publix at 11:38 a.m. During lunch, they discussed meeting back up after work to go see the movie 22 Jump Street, and agreed to see the 5 p.m. showing. On the way back to the office, Ross's friend stopped at the local Home Depot so that he could pick up some light bulbs that he needed at home. After dropping him back at the Treehouse parking lot, Ross went to his car, opened the door, and stuck his arm in to put the light bulbs on the passenger seat. From there, he went back into the office to continue his workday and sexting of multiple women. At 3:16 p.m., Ross texted Leanna and asked, "When you picking up my buddy?" since she would be the one getting him from daycare so that he could go to the movies with his friends. An hour later, at 4:16, Ross left the office for the day and headed back to the car in the parking lot. He got in and began driving away less than 10 seconds later. After around 2 miles, Ross turned his head to the right to change lanes, which is when he discovered the unthinkable. Baby Cooper strapped lifeless in his car seat. Ross quickly pulled into a parking lot of a shopping center called Acres Mill and pulled Cooper out of the car. Other patrons in the parking lot took notice as Ross began screaming, "What have I done? I've killed my son." He attempted for a few seconds to perform CPR but couldn't gain his composure, so one of these witnesses tried to help and take over. However, it was clear to the man attempting CPR and everyone else who saw Cooper laying on the ground that he was already gone. Several people in the parking lot dialed 911 to report what was going on.
Exactly what happened.
The guy pulled in the parking lot and the baby's not breathing, it doesn't look like.
While some of the spectators were attempting to revive Cooper, Ross stepped away to call the Little Apron Academy. He knew that Leanna would be arriving soon to pick him up, and he didn't want her to panic when she realized he wasn't there. However, he was unable to get through to anyone at the center. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to warn Leanna or anyone at the daycare about what happened before she showed up. When Leanna arrived at Little Apron, she walked back to Cooper's classroom, expecting to see him smile and run to her like he always did. However, when Cooper's teacher saw Leanna, she said, "What are you doing here?" Leanna said that she was there to get Cooper, but immediately felt her stomach drop when the teacher said, "Cooper isn't here."
What did you think?
I didn't know what to think. It didn't make any sense.
Were you scared?
Absolutely, immediately.
What were the thoughts?
Did somebody take him from daycare?
She ran to talk to the people at the front desk and proceeded to say, "I hope Ross didn't forget him in the car." All of the employees thought that was a hasty presumption and tried to reassure her that surely Ross just took him to lunch or had possibly taken him home. But Leanna knew that wasn't the case. She had already spoken to Ross about picking Cooper up and knew that he was going to the movies before coming home for the evening. She then started to panic, thinking that perhaps someone had taken Cooper from daycare, and even though the staff encouraged her to stay there, she said that she needed to find her husband. An employee of Little Apron went with Leanna to drive to Ross's work, because by that point, he wasn't answering his phone. When they got there, she noticed that his car was gone, so she and the Little Apron employee went inside and sat down in the lobby. That's when they noticed a breaking story on the news. Right before Leanna's phone started ringing, it was a detective asking where she was. He told her to stay there because they needed to come and talk to her, and Leanna said to the detective, "It's bad, isn't it?" To which he replied, "Yes, it's bad." From there, the detectives proceeded to tell Leanna that Cooper had passed away, but her reaction to the news wasn't at all what they expected. Even though everyone handles grief differently, it's highly likely that Leanna was in shock. She was surprisingly calm, and her first question was, "Where's my husband?" Now, what appears to have just happened was a tragedy like I mentioned earlier that affects nearly 40 families every year. It's an unthinkable and horrific situation that doesn't just happen to negligent parents, but to all walks of life, races, socioeconomic, and education statuses. It's something that has been referred to as forgotten baby syndrome, and typically occurs when a parent deviates from their typical routine, often forgetting or creating a false memory of dropping their child off at school or daycare. It's been described as similar to when our brains go on autopilot. We've all experienced either driving home from work or school, and it's such a routine task that when you reach your destination, you don't even remember the drive there. When parents deviate from their normal routine or have other things on their mind, they can sometimes forget to drop off their child, or they actually believe that they did, combining memories from other days when they actually had. Even though it's a scientifically proven phenomenon, while some people feel sympathy for the parents who lose children in this way, others find themselves saying things like, "That could never happen to me," or "I would never forget my child in the car."
It is shocking, but much more common than you might think. Children left in cars when temperatures are soaring.
This happens to the most loving and caring parents. Literally, we have had a veterinarian, a doctor, a dentist, a professor, a school principal, and even a rocket scientist.
It's easy to judge parents harshly since our duty as parents is to keep our children safe. The fact of the matter is, no one thinks it could happen to them until it does, which is why organizations have set out to increase awareness about the fact that it can truly happen to anyone. In fact, Ross Harris had recently seen promotions from Governor Nathan Deal's Look Again campaign, encouraging parents to take a second look in their back seat before getting out of their cars. When officers and first responders arrived at the scene, they immediately believed that this behavior was odd, to say the least. He was yelling in a monotone voice, periodically shrieking, and in their opinion, his reactions seemed forced and disingenuous. While they worked on Cooper, they put Ross in the back of the police car where he said, "I forgot to do a second look. I swore I dropped him off." When the crime scene technicians arrived, they immediately noticed that the inside of the car had a strong, hot, musty, urine-soaked diaper smell. Another officer noticed that it could only be likened to the smell of death. On the way and after they arrived at the police station, officers noticed that it seemed like Ross was trying to engage in casual conversation, which given the circumstances was pretty bizarre. Before questioning, Ross was seen alone in the room going back and forth between calm and hysterical. When the detectives came in to interview him, he explained everything he did that day, and that forgetting Cooper was an accident. He even said that after watching videos about other parents who had forgotten their children in hot cars, his worst fear was that it would happen to him and Cooper. However, what he failed to mention was that he actually went back to his car during lunch to drop off the light bulbs, and that he had been texting multiple women throughout the day. He said that he and Leanna had a good relationship with typical marriage's ups and downs, but the detectives would soon learn that that would not be the case. When Leanna got to the station, she told the detectives that it was a fear of hers that Ross would forget Cooper in the car, and she had actually sent him an email with a video about a father forgetting his child and wrote, "Don't be this dad." When she was finally able to speak to Ross, their conversation, as well as both of their behaviors through the whole ordeal, started to make the investigators wonder if this really was just a tragic accident. I don't think any of us can predict how we would react to learning our child has died, especially if your spouse was the cause of their death. Many people discussing this case say that if they found out their child was gone, they'd be sobbing, wanting to scratch their eyes out, writhing in pain at the thought of their child suffering. So it's not hard to understand why many people lost sympathy for Ross and Leanna when neither of them seemed to be doing any of these things. Like I said earlier, shock is a possibility, but some of the things Leanna said when she spoke to Ross were sketchy at best. When she first saw him, she immediately jumped up to give him a hug as he broke down crying. Ross literally said things like, "Why is this happening to me? Why me?" instead of asking, "Why did this happen to our little boy?" The most disturbing part of their interaction to me was when Leanna said, "Do you think we'll have more children?" And when Ross said he was comforted by the fact that Cooper was in heaven and that even if he could, he wouldn't bring him back because his time on this earth is done.
Can I ask you a weird question?
Yeah.
Do you think we'll have more kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to have more kids. I don't want just because we lost one child means we can't have any more. I want more kids. I'm just gonna miss it.
As a parent myself, I can't imagine a world where my first thought after my child just passed away would be, "Oh well, I can always have another." Most people don't even think about getting another pet after their dog dies, at least for a little while, let alone hours after their death. Also, even though it's impossible, I think if any parent had the ability to bring their child back, they would. It's not like Cooper spent a long life with medical issues, suffering, or anything like that. So to say he wouldn't bring him back if he had the chance to do so is just wild. However, it was this comment that really caused people to believe that Leanna was at the very least complicit in what Ross had done to Cooper. Shortly after investigators finished speaking to Ross, the lead detective Phil Stoddard told him that he was being arrested for felony murder and cruelty to children. Ross acted completely confused, saying that what happened was an accident. However, he also started saying things like, "I had no malicious intent," which raised the detective's eyebrow. This isn't a typical jargon people normally use, and it was almost like Ross had looked into what malicious intent meant and what constitutes felony murder. Regardless, after the arrest, his phone and computers at work and home were seized. What was on the devices caused the investigators to believe there was a potential motive for Cooper's death. There they discovered that in the 7 months leading up to the incident, Ross had sent more than 5,000 whisper messages and 40,000 texts to women, and even underage girls between the ages of 15 and 17. During the day while Cooper was dying in the hot car, Ross was having sexual conversations with 6 different women, sent photos of his penis, and requested and received photos of women's breasts. They found out that he had previously met up with women for sex, on one occasion in his home while Leanna was at work, and even paid to have sex with prostitutes. It also appeared that he visited a subreddit page called Child Free, where people advocate living a child-free life. He also replied to posts such as one by a user that said, "I hate being married with children. The novelty has worn off." The day Cooper died at 9:15, Ross commented, "I miss having time by myself and going out with friends. My wife is upset when I want to go out with friends. I love my son and all, but we both need escapes." About 2 minutes later, the original poster replied, "Maybe that's our issue too. I need a break from love." At 9:24, Ross responded, "Agreed, we both need that." Ross described himself in messages as a sex addict and said that if he didn't have a child, he would divorce Leanna. He said that his goal in life was to have sex with as many women as possible, and investigators believe that these interactions pointed a clear picture that Ross wanted to live a child-free life so that he could fulfill his fantasies. Usually during cases like this, parents are charged with things like criminal negligence or manslaughter, if they are charged with anything at all. Very rarely are they charged for purposefully murdering their child, but after the discoveries on Ross's phone, his charges were upgraded to malice murder. After the preliminary hearing, people started to attack Leanna's character, saying that she was the worst mother for supporting Ross, especially after the evidence of his affairs came out. However, the indictment only implicated Ross, and investigators no longer believed that Leanna was involved. By July 3rd, Cobb Superior Court Judge Frank Cox denied Ross bail, and his charges were upgraded again to malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, cruelty to children in the 1st and 2nd degree, criminal attempt to commit a felony, and dissemination of harmful materials to minors. He remained in jail until the trial, but during that time, Leanna filed for divorce after she began learning the full extent of his infidelity in their marriage. The new judge on the case, Mary Stanley, also granted a motion for a change of venue. Because with all of the media attention the case was garnering, it became clear that Ross would be unable to have a fair trial with an impartial jury in Cobb County. The trial was moved to Glenn County and began on October 3rd, 2016. During the state's opening statement, prosecutor Chuck Boring characterized Harris as a person living a double life. He said, You will see the deception and the double life, how he behaved and how he lied in this case. He emphasized the defendant intended to kill Cooper. In defense attorney H. Maddox Kilgore's opening statement, he said that Cooper's death was not a result of premeditation, but instead was a tragic accident. He said, "What you are going to see in this trial is that responsible is not the same thing as criminal. The evidence will show that Ross loved that little boy more than anything. Cooper's death was an accident. It was always an accident, and that is what he told the police over and over again. This was not intentional." He also alleged that the Cobb County Police Department made up evidence when several first responders took the stand. The jury saw disturbing photos and video of Cooper's lifeless body laying on the hot concrete of the shopping center. Brad Schumpert, a technician with the Cobb County Police Department's evidence unit, said he had some scratches on his face. He had a shirt that had bicycles on it and little tennis shoes. Dozens of witnesses ranging from family, friends, and co-workers to Cooper's daycare teachers testified that Ross was a loving father who would have never intentionally hurt Cooper. Many of the women who Ross had affairs with in person and online took the stand as well, and they all testified to the fact that he never had a bad word to say about Cooper and always talked about how much he loved his son. Some of the most disturbing testimony came from the medical examiner, who said that baby Cooper died as a result of hypothermia. The jury was shown photos of Cooper's body taken during the autopsy, and the medical examiner described in detail how Cooper would have suffered in the time leading up to his death. He said Cooper would have experienced nausea, he would have had a headache and would have become dehydrated. He may have had seizures. Even at his young age, he would have had anxiety, because he's been in a car seat before and he's just strapped in there, and he probably would have struggled as he was becoming more and more uncomfortable. According to heat transfer specialist David Branny, as Cooper passed away inside the SUV, temperatures reached a high of 125 degrees Fahrenheit. When Ross returned to his car after lunch, the temperature inside the SUV would have been close to 98 degrees, and the medical examiner testified that Cooper might have still been alive at that temperature. Tension escalated in the courtroom as the lead defense attorney cross-examined Detective Phil Stoddard. The defense pointed out several discrepancies in Stoddard's testimony from a preliminary hearing in July 2014. During that hearing, Stoddard claimed that Ross had searched for the phrase, "How hot does it need to be for a child to die inside a hot car?" It was later discovered that a video titled, "How hot does it get inside a parked car?" appeared on Ross's Reddit homepage, and he had only clicked on it, not searched the topic himself. The jury was given an up-close look of the SUV where Cooper lost his life. Following this viewing, the defense requested a mistrial, arguing that jurors have to be given free rein to substitute their vantage point for the evidence. The prosecutor referred to the vehicle as the murder weapon and stated that jurors needed to see where the defendant was sitting while he was messing around in his car, while his child was sitting right beside him. Judge Mary Staley ultimately rejected the mistrial request. Prosecutors were then able to bring the crime scene into the courtroom after a 3D scan expert displayed a scan of the inside of Harris's SUV. The scan included an image of a doll positioned in the car seat to represent Cooper. Outside the jury's presence, the defense raised objections to the scan, labeling it as a reenactment and questioning the positioning of the car seat. Regardless, the judge permitted the scan to be shown to the jury. Memory and attention specialist Dr. Gene Brewer informed jurors that it was absolutely possible for Ross to have experienced a memory lapse after leaving Chick-fil-A with Cooper and driving to work. Brewer also indicated that Ross might have formed a false memory of dropping Cooper off at daycare, potentially due to habit, like the autopilot phenomenon we talked about earlier. However, Brewer also said that if Ross had intentionally killed Cooper, the memory lapse theory would not be relevant. He further acknowledged that this case contained some unique aspects, such as sexting, that set it apart from other instances of hot car deaths. The prosecution asked, "Have you ever been familiar with any other cases where the defendant said, 'I need an escape. I love my son and all, but we both need an escape'?" 10 minutes before locking him in a car, Brewer responded, "No, I'm not familiar with any cases." The defense star witness was Leanna Harris herself, who testified that even though she divorced Ross for being a lousy husband, she believed that he loved Cooper and would have never hurt him on purpose.
Why did you do that?
This is never about me defending Ross. When you get on a stand and you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, that's what you're supposed to do. And that's what I did. I couldn't get up there and say that he was a bad father because it wasn't true.
In addition to all of the evidence related to Cooper's death and the events that occurred that day, the jury also saw evidence pertaining to Ross sexting underage girls. Now, I'm going to spare you from the extremely graphic language used in these messages, but they are written in detail in the case documents. I can provide in the description. Unfortunately for the jury, they also had to view enlarged photos that Ross sent these girls, including color photos of his erect you know what. They saw him pressuring and essentially begging at least one underage high school student to send him nudes, and even tried to offer her money to meet her in her school's parking lot for oral sex. On November 14, 2016, Justin Ross Harris was found guilty of malice murder and felony murder, both which carry a mandatory life sentence. He was also found guilty of cruelty to children, criminal attempt to commit a felony, and sentenced to 10 years for attempt to commit sexual exploitation of a child, and 1 year each for 2 counts of dissemination of harmful material to a minor.
As to count 1, the court imposes the sentence of, as to malice murder, with the jury having found the defendant guilty, sentence of the court is life to serve in confinement without parole. My final observation is this, Mr. Harris, I went back and reviewed and thought about your statement to the police and your statement to your wife when you were taken into custody. And it stood out to me that in both of those, you took the occasion to express your wish that you would be an advocate so that people would never do this again to their children. And I would say, perhaps not in the way that you intended, but you in fact have accomplished that goal. All right. Anything else for the state?
No, Your Honor.
Anything else for the defense? You can take the defendant into custody.
In 2022, Ross and his defense team appealed his convictions for murder and first-degree child cruelty. In the appeal, the defense argued that the evidence provided during the trial was insufficient and that there was too much emphasis on his extramarital and occasionally illegal sexual conduct. Even though the initial appeal was denied, the defense decided to take it to the Georgia Supreme Court. In the appeal, the Supreme Court stated that while the evidence shown during Ross's trial was enough to support his convictions for the crimes against Cooper, some of the evidence about his sexual activities should have been excluded. According to state statute, much of this evidence was considered unnecessary and overly damaging and prejudicial. This included the illegal sexual messages and photo exchanged with 4 minors, 9 enlarged color photos of Ross's penis, and the information that Ross had hired a prostitute 3 times. Additionally, it stated that the trial court made a mistake by not granting the defense's request to separate the trial for Cooper's death from the sexual crimes against minors. It stated that the court incorrectly believed that all of the sexual evidence was relevant to the murder charges. Because of these errors, the Supreme Court ultimately overturned the charges associated with Cooper's death, stating that the jury heard and saw an extensive amount of improperly admitted evidence. The Cobb County District Attorney's Office released a statement expressing disappointment with the decision and said that due to this ruling, important evidence regarding Ross's motive is now inaccessible. After conducting a comprehensive review of the case, the prosecutors determined that they would not pursue a retrial for Ross on the overturned charges. Even though he will not be retried for murder, the sexual crimes were not a part of the appeal. Due to these charges being misdemeanors, on Father's Day, June 16, 2024, Ross was released from prison and will serve the remainder of his 12-year sentence in the Cobb County Jail. So that's where this case has landed now, with many people agreeing that there wasn't enough evidence to show premeditated malice murder, and others believing that he just got off for purposefully killing his son. Many have said that this appeal could have probably been prevented if the original judge had separated the trials, because even though the prosecution wouldn't have been able to admit as much of the sexual evidence, there would still been enough to prove their theory that he wanted to be free, especially given the comments he made on that Reddit post the same morning. Others think that the prosecution would have been better off going for a conviction of negligent homicide, because they believe that it was Ross's own distractions that caused his lapse of memory. It's not like he was distracted by stresses outside of his control. He was clearly trying to make it to work as fast as possible so he could get back to sexting women. If he hadn't been living this devious double life, maybe his mind would have been more focused on getting his son to school rather than getting to the office to take dick pics. I would really like to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you think that Ross intended to kill Cooper so that he could be a free bachelor? Or do you think he forgot his son was in the back seat within less than a minute after leaving Chick-fil-A? Some have argued that if Ross really intended on doing this as an educated web developer, he would have known better than to leave all of that evidence on his devices. and wouldn't have been planning on a family vacation, researching child passport prices. Other people also bring up the fact that Ross went to his car during lunch and apparently didn't see Cooper, who, at that point, very well could have still been alive, possibly in order to check to see if he had died yet. However, others point out that if he wanted Cooper to die in the car, he probably wouldn't have parked in a space so easily seen by other people passing by, and that was in the shade for a good portion of the morning. There are countless variables, possibilities, and theories on the motive or lack thereof, so you'll have to tell me your thoughts in the comments. Trying to remain objective and non-judgmental in situations like this can get extremely difficult, especially when it involves someone as awful as Ross Harris. Regardless if he didn't intend to kill Cooper, he was responsible for his safety, and I believe that if he hadn't been focused on cheating on his wife, he wouldn't have forgotten about his son. That's what makes this case so much harder to accept and empathize with than other hot car deaths. Even though Cooper shouldn't have had to die to raise this important conversation, at least it's highlighted how devastating and consequential leaving a child in the car can be. For years, organizations like kidsandcars.org, Safe Kids Worldwide, and the Heat Stroke Awareness Network have tried to get legislation passed that could help prevent future hot car deaths. This would include education and awareness initiatives to educate people about the dangers of leaving children in cars, along with requirements for car manufacturers to install reminder systems that alert drivers if a child is left in the back seat, and alarms to notify people outside the vehicle, reporting protocols for bystanders to report incidents or assist in emergencies, and strict legal penalties for caregivers who leave children in hot cars. Nowadays, cars have the technology to remind us to put on our seatbelt, remind us when our oil and gas is low, or even when we've left the lights on. Maybe next technology can save a child from dying in a hot car. Cooper Harris passed away at just 22 months old, with his entire life ahead of him. I don't think anyone can say for 100% certain whether Ross Harris killed him on purpose, but regardless, it was his duty as a father to keep him safe. Ross failed to do that in the worst way, and now Cooper is gone. Even if it were an accident, the fact of the matter is, Ross Harris is an absolute creep who is willing to throw his entire life away with his devoted wife and beautiful son for some action on the side, and he destroyed countless lives in the process. Maybe he's not a calculated killer, but he is a horrible human being who, in my opinion, deserves to be locked up for a very, very long time. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe and look again.